Well, hello there. I didn't see you come in. Make yourself at home. Have a drink. While I give some attention to some underappreciated characters and storylines that I personally love. And I hope you grow to love as well.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are reading Swamp Thing number 134. And just a little catch up before we get started with that. In the last issue, we saw Swamp Thing fight a giant flower monster that had grown super big when the green freaked out when Swamp Thing and his doppelganger were fighting. So Swamp Thing grew himself a giant body, did a big fight with Thunderpetal, which was the name of the big flower monster. And because Thunderpetal was a creation of Tefe, his daughter, Swamp Thing was unable to defeat it even though he grew to the same size as Thunderpetal. But luckily, Tefe stepped up. She walked up straight to Thunderpetal and shrunk him down and then ended up unmaking him in her hand, which was kind of creepy. In the meantime, we saw Abby leave the swamp because she was very upset that Swamp Thing had tricked her with a doppelganger. And at the end of the last issue, she arrived at Chester's house just as he was finishing up packing for his move to New Orleans, and she asked if she could ride with him there. And that's where we left off on the last issue. So first things first, with issue 134, we got the cover here. We see Abby is walking on top of some grass. She has a duffel bag in her hands, and she looks kind of sad, and maybe she's looking back towards the swamp or something. And then underneath her, we see all the roots of the grasses are connecting and forming the face of Swamp Thing under the ground below her. And we see this issue is written by Nancy Collins with art by Scott Eaton and Kim DeMulder. So we pick up immediately as Tefe has defeated the monster and Swamp Thing's very happy with her. So he's picking her up and he's kind of swinging her around and he's saying, "Daddy is very proud of his little girl. You were very brave facing that giant Daisy. Mommy and Daddy are very proud of you. Aren't we, Abby?" And then he looks around for a second and he says, "Abby?" And then he continues to look even harder and still saying her name. And then he realizes something's wrong. Abby's gone. So he hands Tefe off to Lady Jane. And it seems like he's freaking out a bit about this because he says, "Oh my God, Abby." And I think he's freaking out because he's looking at the house and he sees it smash and he saw her go that way before. So he runs to the house and then he begins to look through the rubble and all these vines come out and help him lift the wood and beams of the house. And he's saying, "Abby, where are you? Answer me, please answer me." And then Lady Jane approaches and says, "Prime Founder?" And Swamp Thing walks over to her as he finishes looking through the rubble and he says, "She's not here. Where could she be?" Then we cut to Abby inside of Chester's truck and they are driving to New Orleans and they are just passing the sign that says Houma City Limits. And the name of this issue is She's Leaving Houma. And we can see that she is crying and stuff, so she's super sad right now. And Chester, who's driving, is kind of not sure what to do, but he decides to see if she wants to talk it out. So he asks her, "Do you want to talk about it?" And she replies, "I don't know if I can, not just yet. Everything's still jumbled up in my head, but I do know that I can't stay with him. Not feeling the way I do right now." And then she looks out the window longingly and we see she's looking out at the trees on the side of the road and they're forming Swamp Thing's face. And she says, "You trust someone with all your dreams, your deepest secrets, only to discover you don't know him at all. It just really hurts, you know?" And Chester replies, "Yeah, I know." Then we cut to them having reached Louisiana and New Orleans, and they are pulling up to an apartment building that belongs to Troy and Carl. And the building looks pretty nice. It actually surprises Abby because when she sees it, she says, "Wow, is this really Troy and Carl's place?" And Chester gets out of his van and asks, "Uh-huh, what do you think? Troy and Carl rented the 2 top floors. My apartment's the whole attic." And Abby says, "It's gorgeous." And then as Abby steps out of Chester's van, Troy and Carl walk out of the front door and Troy asks her, "How do you like our new digs?" And she replies, "I'm impressed, but how can you two afford it?" And Carl replies, "Well, I'm an architect and Troy is a troubleshooter for a big computer consulting firm." And I know we'd heard this before. I don't know why she doesn't remember this, but she says to him, "Oops, I keep forgetting that people have real jobs that actually pay money. It's going to take some time to get used to. It's been a long time since I've had to deal with the real world." Then we cut to Chester's house in Houma, Louisiana, And we see Jojo, the bartender of Jojo's bar, who's also friends with Chester, is putting a for sale sign in the lawn. And as he's hammering, he's whistling. And all of a sudden, someone says behind him, "Where is my wife?" And when Jojo turns around, he sees Swamp Thing. And also, if you remember, Swamp Thing's got his new body that looks a lot more threatening and imposing. And even though Jojo has not seen this new body, he doesn't seem to be shocked or scared or anything. So he looks at Swamp Thing and he says, "Watch who you're sneaking up on. You nearly gave me a heart attack, Cap." But Swamp Thing doesn't respond to this. All he says is, "Have you seen Abby?" And Jojo replies, "Yeah, I seen her." And Swamp Thing asks, "Where is she?" And Jojo replies, "She's with Chester." And Swamp Thing seems confused by this, and he says, "Chester?" And we also see that while they're talking, they're on the front lawn in this neighborhood. So all the other neighbors start looking and gathering around as they're walking by because there's a giant swamp monster on the lawn talking to a man. But Swamp Thing's not paying attention to them at all. Jojo does notice, but he continues talking to Swamp Thing, and Swamp Thing says to him, "Did she say when she is coming back?" And Jojo is trying to figure out how to say this to Swamp Thing. He kind of rubs his face, and he says, "I don't know how to say this, big guy, but I don't think your old lady's coming back." And then Swamp Thing looks away from him, kind of guilty, and Jojo asks him, "Look, man, it's none of my business, but what the hell did you do to make her cry like that?" And Swamp Thing replies, "I betrayed her with myself." Then we cut back to New Orleans inside of Chester's apartment, and Abby and him are unpacking, and Chester is saying to Abby, "So, what do you plan on doing now?" And Abby replies, "I'm not sure. I really haven't given it much thought, to tell the truth. I need some time to think and sort out how I feel about my relationship with Alec. All I know right now is I'm confused. I thought I'd get used to the weirdness by now, but it's just not happening." And as she says this last line, she's standing next to one of Chester's potted plants on the counter, and the plant begins to sprout and grow. It seems that Swamp Thing has found them inside of Chester's apartment. I guess he found her off page after he was done talking to Jojo. So he grows his full body, and as he stands there, we see Abby has her hands on her hips, and her body language says that she's not ready for this. She's mad, probably. And Swamp Thing says to her, "Abby, we have to talk. Why did you leave without telling me where you were going?" And Abby immediately goes from 1 to 10. She gets super angry and says, "How dare you say that? How dare you? Did you bother to tell me when you left?" And Swamp Thing says, "Abby, I can explain. I realize what I did was thoughtless, but you must understand, I had no choice. The green called, and I had to answer. I only did what I did, so you would not think I did not care." And this, of course, does not make her feel any better. In fact, it probably makes it worse because she continues yelling, "Is that how you show you care? By going off and leaving me with one of your cast-offs for company? You promised you wouldn't leave me and the baby alone. You lied to me. You made a promise you knew you wouldn't keep. Damn you, Alec. I trusted you, and you betrayed me. What's more important to you, me and the baby or the goddamn green?" And then she turns around and faces her back to Swamp Thing, and he reaches out to try to grab her shoulder, and he says, "Abby, it's not as simple as that." But Abby cuts him off, saying, "How do I even know I'm talking to the real you? I could be pouring my heart out to one of your secondhand suits again." I love this panel because as they're arguing, Chester is in the background just trying to not get involved. And Swamp Thing kind of begs her, saying, "Abby, please, if you won't come home for me, come home for Tefe's sake. You're her mother. Surely that means something." And you might have been able to guess, but that was not the correct thing to say. So that infuriates Abby, and she turns around and she smacks him on the face, and she yells, "Don't use Tefe against me, damn you!" And we also see as her hand pulls away from his face, it has blood on it because she's cut herself on Swamp Thing's new spikes on his face. And as she looks at her injury, we do see there's quite a bit of blood pouring out, and she says, "Ow!" And then she turns away again and begins to walk, and Swamp Thing reaches out to her saying, "You're bleeding." But Abby yells back, "Don't touch me!" And Swamp Thing pleads with her. He doesn't move towards her, but he reaches out and says, "Abby, please, I love you." And Abby stops walking at this, and with her back to him still, she says, "I love you too, Alec, And then she turns her head so she can see him, but we can see tears streaming down her face as she says, "But maybe that's not enough. I think you should leave now, Alec. Tell Tefe Mommy misses her." And then she turns her head to face away from him again and waits a second. And I guess Swamp Thing gets the hint because he leaves his body and goes back to Terrebonne Parish. And Abby asks, "Is he gone?" And Chester replies, "Yeah." And then he walks over to Abby as she's holding her hand and he can see the blood and he says, "Here, let me look at that." And then we cut to a little while later as he finishes bandaging her hand and she's saying to him, "I'm sorry you had to see that, Chester." And Chester replies, "Nonsense. What are friends for, right? Besides, you were there to hold my hand when Liz left me." And then Abby begins to cry as she begins to think about all the stuff that's happened in her relationship with Swamp Thing. So we get like a little flashback panel where we see Anton Arcane in his human mutated body. We see Dr. Barclay, who was keeping Liz hostage. We see the Dark Pirate Conrad, and even some callbacks from the original Swamp Thing run from the 70s. And as she thinks about these, she says, "Oh God, Chester, what am I going to do? I love Alec, I really do, but I can't continue living this way. It's driving me mad. My life has been nothing but an endless series of brushes with death, madness, and evil. All I want to be is left alone, to live with my husband and raise our child in peace. But something always comes along to interfere with our happiness." So over this narration, we see her image of what her perfect family is, and there's like silhouettes of Swamp Thing in his old body standing next to Abby, and she's holding Tefe's hand. But then as she talks about something interfering with her happiness, we see Swamp Thing walking away from her towards, I think it's John Constantine, but he's in the shadows. And then Abby is crying, and then next to her, Lady Jane is playing with Tefe. Then we cut back to Terrebonne Parish, and we see Swamp Thing is growing his body again, and he's right next to his house that, of course, is all demolished and everything still. And it's kind of like a representation of their relationship at the moment. And Swamp Thing looks at it, and he begins to cry. And then he sits down on a fallen tree, and we get an interesting panel that's a point of view shot of him. So we're looking down at his feet from his point of view, and we can see teardrops falling, and they're falling so much that it literally is forming a puddle at his feet. So it seems like it's finally connecting that maybe something is really wrong. It's not just going to be an apology that's going to fix this, and maybe even his relationship with Abby is over for good. Then we cut back to Chester and Abby in his apartment, and she's looking at the bandages on her hand, and she says, "I don't think I'm asking for much out of life. It's just not fair." And she begins to tear up again, and Chester tries to comfort her, saying, "Abby, don't cry." And then he reaches out, and he wipes a tear from under her eye, and we see, like, she's kind of holding his hand a little bit as he does this, and he says, "Please, don't cry. Everything will be all right. You've just got to give it time." And then somehow, I don't even know how that got here, but they are now embracing each other really closely, like their hands are on each other's hips, and Abby is saying, "Chester, you're one of the sweetest guys I've ever known. Thanks for being there for me." And then it looks like she makes the first move here because her face moves towards Chester's, but Chester responds and they kiss. And it lasts like 3 panels, so it seems like it's a pretty passionate kiss. So then Abby puts her hand to his face and pulls away, like kind of in shock, and she says, "Chester." And Chester seems embarrassed. He says, "I'm sorry, Abby. God, I can't believe I did that. You must think I'm some kind of sleazeball." But then Abby puts her hand around the back of his head and pulls him closer. And this time they don't kiss. She just kind of puts her forehead on his. And she says, "Chester, you know better than that. What happened wasn't wrong. It's just not right for us. You're the best friend I ever had, and I don't want anything spoiling that." And then they separate, and Abby says, "If I'm going to be in any shape to go job hunting in the big city tomorrow, I better crash soon." And Chester says, "You can sleep in my room until you get on your feet and find your own place." And Abby replies, "I couldn't put you out like that." But Chester cuts her off saying, "Nonsense. I won't hear of it any other way. I'll just sleep on the couch." And then as Abby goes to her room, she goes to Chester and gives him a kiss on the cheek and says, "You really are a Southern gentleman." And then as she walks into the room and closes the door, we see it seems like Chester was kind of hoping that would have gone further or something, but he just stands there with his back facing her and gives a sigh. Then we cut to the Sunderland headquarters in Washington, D.C. And the last time we were here, we saw Connie Sunderland and Dr. Polygon performing some kind of satanic ritual to revive her father's body from cryostorage. And they're in some sort of waiting room, and Connie's sitting on a chair saying, "What's taking them so damn long?" And Dr. Polygon, who's standing next to her, is saying, "A thorough checkup does take time." And Connie replies, "If I wanted your worthless opinion, Mr. Pseudoscience, I'd have asked for it." And Dr. Polygon nervously replies saying, "Yes, Miss Sunderland." Then we see a doctor come out of a room and walk towards them, and he's got like a surgical mask on and stuff, and we can see behind him there's x-rays. And when Connie sees him, she immediately stands up and says, "Well?" And the doctor replies, "I don't believe it. If I hadn't been present at the original autopsy, I would have sworn it was some kind of hoax." And Connie replies, "But he's all right, isn't he?" And the doctor responds, "He's perfectly healthy for a man who's been dead for the past 5 years." And then Connie walks past him and pushes him aside and says, "Thank you, doctor. I trust you'll destroy any evidence of your examination." And then she walks into the room that the doctor came from and she says, "Daddy?" And we get a pretty creepy shot of Dr. Sunderland sitting on a cushioned chair, and he's got all these electrodes tied to him. And he also has one of his feet on the cushion. So like he's wearing like a hospital gown. So you can literally almost see his junk. And he doesn't move at all as Connie walks in, and he says, "Connie, dearest, come closer. I wish to speak with you, my child." And thankfully, as Connie kind of kneels in front of him, he puts his leg down back on the floor so nothing's exposed. And as Connie kneels, she says, "Daddy, you're back. After all this time, you're really back." And then we see his creepy hands reach out and start to caress her face. And he says, "Yes, I'm back. And I don't want to waste a single precious second of my new life. We must be ready to act against our enemies, Constance. Once news of my return spreads, they'll be quick to move on us. For the time being, it would be wise to keep my resurrection under wraps. You shall remain in charge of the day-to-day running of the corporation. However, I want complete control of bioengineering. I've had a long time to contemplate the destruction of Swamp Thing." And then Connie stands up, and she seems pretty happy, and she kind of caresses his chin and says, "Whatever you say, Daddy. I'll have Smithers make sure the crew in bioengineering understand the national security clause in their contract is now in effect." And then Sunderland says to her, "Oh, and I'd like to have Dr. Polygon help me with my new project." And Connie replies, "Polygon? What possible use could you find for that self-important ninny?" And Sunderland replies, Now, my dear, he did bring me back to life. Besides, I was thinking of using the good doctor as a test subject, not a research assistant." And then Connie smiles and says, "It's good to see you back to your old self." Then we get to the next morning, and we see Abby is having a cup of coffee at the dining room table in Chester's apartment, and she's reading the newspaper, and she's looking through the Help Wanted ads. Then we cut to a doctor's office that's called Doc in a Box. And it seems this is the first place she's going to try out today to get a job at. And the nurse who's interviewing Abby asks, "Do you have any local references, Miss Holland?" And Abby replies, "I served as the on-call nurse for a few months at the Elysium Lawns Center for Autistic Children in Houma a couple years back." And the nurse asks, "Anything more recent?" And Abby nervously replies, "Well, I got my training in Europe." And in case you didn't know, she is not lying here. This is actually a pretty deep cut. In Abby's first appearance in Swamp Thing 2 from the 70s run, she is a nurse who helps out Matt Cable when he's searching for Swamp Thing in Eastern Europe. But of course, to anybody who doesn't know all that information, it sounds like a lie because there's not really a way to verify that. So the nurse that's interviewing her says, "I see. Thank you for your time, Miss Holland. We'll be keeping your application on file in case we should have another position open in the near future." Then we cut to Abby walking down the main street of New Orleans, and she sees a flower shop, and she goes in to check to see if they have any work, and they don't. Then she walks by what I think is a bar because there's a sign on the window that says what I think are the names of drinks like sangria and zombies. And just below that sign, there's a Help Wanted sign. So as she moves to the door to open it, it seems like they've just hired someone because they pull that sign away. Then we cut to a little bit later, and we see her standing in front of a club that's named Club Pulse. And it also says below that it is a topless club, but it does have a waitress wanted sign on the front of it. So she walks in and approaches the bartender at the counter and she says, "I'd like to see about a job." And the bartender asks, "You ever waited tables before?" And Abby replies, "No." And the bartender asks, "You ever worked in a bar before?" And she again answers no. And the bartender asks again, "You afraid to work nights, weekends, and holidays?" And she answers no again, but that's all he needed to hear. He just needs someone who will be here all the time. So he tells her, "You got the job." And she's kind of surprised that it was that quick because she says, "I do?" And then he points to the stage and says, "Yep, go backstage and get yourself outfitted." And she's confused by this too. And she says, "Outfitted?" And he replies, "Yeah, all the waitresses wear costumes." Then we cut to her in the back room and she's looking at her costume, which is not a lot of clothes, as you can imagine. I'm not sure exactly what this type of lingerie is called, but it's like a one-piece bustier that only covers the necessities. And she's also given a set of leggings and some sort of little fanny pack or something that says Club Pulse on it. And she definitely has a look on her face that you could tell she's disappointed. She did not want to do this kind of job. So she sighs and she says, "Well, a gal's got to eat." Then we cut to later that night where she's on her first shift and we see there's all these guys kind of yelling at the stage where there are dancers that are topless. And she's walking over to some of them, taking their orders, and they're like faded. There's all this beer spilled in front of them. One of them's passed out. And as she takes their order, she says, "Let's see, we have a pink squirrel, a kamikaze, and a sex on the beach. That'll be $12.95. And then off panel, we hear someone yell, "Waitress." And she doesn't look up. She just responds, "I'll be with you in just a second, sir." So she finishes with her first table. And then as she walks over to the table that called her, she's still not looking at the men. And she just says, "Now, what can I get for you two, gentle?" But then she looks up and she sees who's sitting at the table and she says, "Oh my God, you?" And then we pull back and we see the two men sitting at the table. One of them is John Constantine, and that's who she was talking about. And the other guy we don't know. And John says to her, "Hello, ducks. Does the hubby know you're working outside the home?" And that, my friends, is where the issue ends. So we'll have to find out what happens in the next issue. But until then, if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains.and-comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And remember, until next time, stay swampy.